Chapter 1, Dust on the Horizon. The prairie sun hung low, a molten coin sinking into the horizon, its heat still clinging to the dusty air long after the day's labor was done. Luke Harlan leaned forward in the saddle, his hat brim pulled low to block the glare. His horse, a rangy bay with ribs faintly visible beneath its hide, carried him down the dirt road into town with a slow, resigned gait, an animal that knew its master pushed too hard and asked too little for himself. The town of Red Creek shimmered ahead, its outlines blurring in the evening haze. A crooked sign above the saloon door swung back and forth in the wind, its hinges squealing like a rusty fiddle. Piano notes drifted from inside, broken and uneven, followed by the laughter men who'd already drowned their worries in cheap whiskey. Spurs clinked on the boardwalks as cowhands swaggered past the general store, calling out to painted girls leaning on the balcony rail above. Luke ignored it all. He wasn't here for whiskey, nor for women. He needed milk. Simple as that. His ranch, miles out in the dry flats, was too barren for cows now. He'd sold off the last of them after the drought and kept only his horses. That left him to ride into town when necessity pressed. And every trip reminded him just how alone a man could feel on a wide-open frontier. The farmhouse lay just outside Red Creek, past a mill road with a scent of cut lumber mixed with sagebrush. Luke dismounted in front of the Monroe place, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud that stirred dust around his spurs. The white paint on the house had long ago peeled to gray. Fences sagged under years of neglect. Yet, through the cracked shutters, he saw a glow, warm, steady, alive. He rapped his knuckles on the weathered door. For a moment, only silence answered, broken by the lowing of cows in the barn. Then the door creaked open, and Clara Monroe stood framed in the lamplight. Her apron was smudged with flour. Her sleeves rolled above strong arms dusted faintly with hay. Stray strands of chestnut hair had slipped from her bun, falling against a face worn by grief yet softened by quiet resilience. She blinked in surprise, the jug of milk she'd been carrying nearly slipping from her hands. "Mr. Harlan," she said, her voice gentle but cautious. "Wasn't expecting company this late." Luke shifted, suddenly aware of the dust on his coat, the stubble on his jaw. "Didn't mean to trouble you, ma'am. Just came for milk. My stores are empty." Clara hesitated, then stepped aside, her gaze flicking toward the lonely stretch of road behind him. "Come in. It ain't right to send a man back out hungry when the sun's dropping." Luke ducked his head and entered. The air smelled of baking bread and wood smoke. The wooden floor creaked under his weight as he followed her into the kitchen. It was a simple room, rough-hewn table, mismatched chairs, and a window that caught the last streaks of gold spilling over the prairie. He felt the weariness and his bones lighten just standing in that glow. Clara poured milk into a tin pail, her hand steady though her eyes lingered on him more than the task. "How's the ranch faring?" she asked softly. Luke let out a slow breath, rubbing a thumb over the rim of his hat. "Dry. Horses keep me busy, but it's quiet. Too quiet." She nodded, as if she understood all the words he left unsaid. Setting the pail before him, she slid a plate of warm bread across the table. "You'll take this too. Can't have you wasting away out there." He met her gaze then, and for the first time in years, the loneliness pressing on his chest seemed to ease. Her eyes, tired though they were, held a kind of light that unsettled him more than any saloon brawl or gunslinger ever had. "Obliged," he murmured, his voice rougher than he intended. He took the bread, breaking it slowly, as if stretching the moment. Outside, the coyotes began their nightly song, a thin, haunting chorus beneath the vast, darkening sky. Luke listened, but his eyes stayed on Clara, who stood at the window with her arms folded, the lamplight outlining her figure against the night. He hadn't come looking for company. He hadn't come looking for anything but milk. Yet as he sat there in the soft glow of her kitchen, the scent of bread lingering in the air, He realized the road home would feel lonelier than ever if he left right away. And for the first time in a long while, Luke Harlan wasn't sure if he wanted to leave at all. Chapter 2, The Widow's Offer. The kitchen lantern burned low, its flame flickering against the window pane, casting golden light across Clara Monroe's worn wooden table. Luke Harlan sat with his hat resting on his knee, shoulders square but uneasy, like a man who'd wandered too far from familiar ground. He hadn't meant to step past her door, hadn't meant for anything beyond a jug of milk, but somehow Clara's voice, soft as a prairie breeze, had pulled him inside. She poured coffee into a chipped enamel cup and slid it across the table. "It ain't much," she said, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "But it's warm." Luke nodded, wrapping his callous hands around the cup. Steam curled upward, carrying the bitter scent of boiled grounds. He lifted it slowly, sipping as though to steady himself. "Don't remember the last time I had coffee that wasn't blackened over a campfire," he admitted. A ghost of a smile tugged at Clara's lips. "Well, this ain't fancy neither, but at least it don't taste like ash." The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't hollow. The sound of the homestead filled it. The tick of the mantel clock, the faint bawl of a calf in the barn, the whisper of wind rattling the shutters. Luke's eyes traced the room. Patched curtains, a shelf of worn crockery, a Bible with frayed pages sitting open as though often read. There was a quiet dignity here, carved out of hardship. Clara busied herself at the counter, her back to him as she cut a slice of pie. The knife trembled slightly in her hand. She wasn't used to company. Not anymore. The town's gossipers had long since stopped calling, and the men, well, most kept their distance from a widow who carried grief like a shadow. Luke cleared his throat. "Didn't mean to impose, ma'am. Just ranch work don't leave a man much time for." He stopped, not sure how to finish. For comfort? For company? For something more than silence? Clara turned, setting the plate in front of him. "It's no imposition. Truth is, I welcome the company. House gets mighty still once the lamps are out." Her eyes met his then, and for a moment he saw the weight she carried. Loneliness etched into her features, tempered with stubborn strength. Luke's chest tightened. He'd seen men break under less than what she lived with every day. He picked up the fork, cutting into the flaky crust. The first bite was warm, sweet, tangy with berries. He chewed slowly, savoring more than just the flavor. "You make a man forget how empty his stomach feels," he said quietly. Clara's laugh came soft, almost startled, as though she hadn't expected herself capable of laughter anymore. "Careful, Mr. Harlan. You keep saying things like that, I might start baking for you regular." Luke met her gaze over the rim of his cup. Something in his eyes, some mix of humor and hunger not for food, but for life itself, made her pulse quicken. She turned away, fussing with a rag that didn't need folding. From outside, a coyote howled, long and mournful, the sound rolling over the prairie like a reminder of all that was wild and unforgiving. Luke set his fork down, listening, then glanced back at her. "Don't seem right," he murmured. "A woman should carry all this alone. Place like this," he gestured to the sturdy walls, the barn beyond, "ought to have more than one set of hands." Clara stiffened. For a heartbeat, she thought he meant pity, and her pride bristled. But then she caught the way his jaw tightened, how his eyes softened even as his shoulders remained hard as oak. This wasn't pity. It was something deeper, something she hadn't felt in a long time. "I manage," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I know you do." Luke's tone carried no doubt. "Stronger than most men I know." The words settled between them, heavier than the silence that followed. Clara looked at him, really looked. The tired lines of his face, the sun-browned skin, the rough hands that spoke of years of toil. But beneath the grit was a man whose solitude mirrored her own. For a moment, She wanted to reach across the table, to let her fingers brush his. Instead, she pulled back, clutching the rag tighter. Luke rose, placing his hat back on his head. I should let you be. Sun's near gone. Clara hesitated, her throat tightening. Then, almost against her will, the word slipped out. Luke, don't rush off next time. There's always coffee here. And pie, if you don't mind me fussing. His eyes lingered on hers, long enough to make her cheeks warm. He gave a slow nod, his voice rough. Reckon I'd like that. When he stepped back into the twilight, the air felt colder, lonelier. Clara stood in the doorway, watching until his horse's figure melted into the dark. Only then did she close the door, her hand pressed against her chest where her heart still raced, faster than it had in years. And Luke, riding away beneath a bruised purple sky, realized the jug of milk on his saddle weighed far less than the thought of returning to her kitchen again. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Saloon. The saloon doors swung open with a creak and a thud, letting in a gust of dry night air and the sharp jangle of spurs. Luke Harlan stepped inside, his broad shoulders filling the frame for a moment before he moved past it, boots thumping against warped planks. The air was thick with cigar smoke and the sour tang of spilled whiskey. A piano banged out a half-hearted tune in the corner, its player more drunk than sober. Men crowded around card tables, coins clinking, voices rising in curses or cheers. Painted girls leaned on the upstairs railing, their laughter lilting, practiced, tired. Luke kept his hat low and his steps slow, moving toward the bar. He wasn't a man for company, but sometimes a shot of rye burned off the day's dust better than anything else. He'd just reached for his glass when a familiar name caught his ear. Monroe Place, a gravelly voice drawled from a nearby card table. Heard she's still sitting on near 20 acres of prime pasture. Damn fool woman can't work it right. Won't be long before she folds. Luke froze, hand tightening around the rim of the glass. His jaw worked as another man laughed, a high, cutting sound that carried across the room. She won't fold. Another answered, this one meaner, harder. She'll hold out stubborn. Always does. That's why we'll take it. A little fire under her boots. She'll sign what we tell her. A ripple of laughter spread around the table. Dice clattered. Coins shifted. But the words hung heavier than the smoke. Luke turned slightly, eyes narrowing beneath his hat brim. For men hunched over the cards, rough cattlemen with dust still clinging to their coats. He recognized one, Earl Bragg, a man who'd once ridden with the same gang that had ambushed Clara's husband. The others were no better, the kind who worked cattle by day and stirred trouble by night. Luke forced himself to turn back to his drink, though every muscle in his back coiled like a spring. He'd learned long ago not to show his hand too soon. Still, their voices carried, each word sharpening the heat in his chest. She's pretty, though. Earl smirked, tossing a coin into the pot. Lonely, too. Wouldn't mind Callan on her myself. Bet she don't keep the bed cold. The men roared with crude laughter. Luke's glass slammed onto the bar, the sound cutting through the noise like a pistol shot. Heads turned, conversations faltered. Luke pushed back from the counter, his boots slow, deliberate, as he crossed the room. The card players looked up, their laughter dimming as his shadow fell across the table. You boys got a lot of talk in you, Luke said, his voice low, steady, dangerous. Reckon it's easy to jaw about a woman when she ain't here to answer. Earl leaned back, a sly grin tugging at his lips. Harlan, didn't know you were in the business of protecting widows. What she giving you? Fresh milk with a smile? The men snickered, but unease flickered in their eyes. Luke didn't flinch. He let the silence grow heavy, his stare never leaving Earl's. Finally he spoke, each word sharp as a knife's edge. You so much as set foot on her land, I'll make sure you don't leave it. That's a promise." The room went still. Even the piano player stopped mid-note. Earl's grin faltered, but he forced a laugh, waving a hand. "Hell, Harlan, no need for barking. We're just joking. Ain't that right, boys?" The others mumbled agreement, eyes dropping back to their cards. Luke stood there another moment, the tension thick enough to choke on. Then he tipped his hat, slow and deliberate, before turning back to the bar. His drink sat untouched. He didn't want it any more. As he pushed through the saloon doors, the night air hit him cool and sharp. The stars stretched endless overhead, but his thoughts were fixed on the glow of a lonely farmhouse just beyond town. Clara Monroe didn't know it yet, but danger was already circling her land. And Luke Harlan, who had come only for milk, knew in his bones he couldn't walk away now. Chapter 4, Gunpowder at Sundown. The prairie sun bled red across the horizon, its light stretching long shadows over the Monroe farm. The field swayed gently in the evening wind, the fences groaning as if under the weight of the day itself. Luke Harlan rode slow up the road, his hat brim low, hand resting near the worn grip of his revolver. He hadn't shaken the words in the saloon. Those men weren't just blowing smoke. They'd meant what they said. And now, as the farmhouse came into view, his worst fear hardened into fact. 3 horses stood tethered to Clara's gate, their reins dragging in the dirt. The animals pawed restlessly, uneasy with the tension hanging in the air. From inside the yard came the sound of raised voices, harsh, demanding, full of threat. Luke slid off his horse without a sound. His boots crunched softly in the dirt as he moved closer, each step measured, every sense alive. Clara stood on her porch, her back pressed against the door, arms folded across her chest in defiance. Facing her were the men from the saloon, Earl Bragg and his crew, dirty coats, whiskey on their breath, and cruelty glinting in their eyes. One of them kicked at the porch rail, making the boards rattle. "Land's wasted on you, Clara," Earl sneered, his voice carrying the cooling air. "Sell it now, or we'll make sure you don't got a choice later." "I won't sell," Clara said, her voice steady despite the fear she couldn't hide from her eyes. "This was my father's land, my husband's. It'll be mine till I'm in the ground." The men laughed, a hard, ugly sound. Earl stepped closer, spurs clinking, his hand brushing the butt of his pistol in a not-so-subtle threat. That was when Luke stepped out of the shadows. His boots thudded against the dirt with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The men turned, laughter dying as they saw him, broad-shouldered, coat dusted from the trail, revolver low at his side. The fading sun caught his eyes, cold steel beneath the brim of his hat. "Evening, boys," Luke said, his voice calm, dangerous. "I reckon you're a long way from the saloon." Earl's grin faltered, but he forced it back, spitting to the side. "Harlan, this don't concern you." Luke stopped a few paces short, his stance loose but ready. "Looks to me like it does. I hear men threaten a woman. It concerns me plenty." Clara's breath caught, though she said nothing. She clutched the porch rail tighter, her knuckles white, as though his presence alone was a rope keeping her from sinking into fear. One of the outlaws, a lanky fellow with mean eyes, shifted his coat to show his pistol. "You looking to die over someone else's land, Harlan?" Luke didn't move. His voice dropped lower, steady as bedrock. "You lay one hand on her, you won't live to regret it." The words hung in the stillness. The cicadas had gone quiet. The prairie hushed, as if the whole world waited for crack of gunfire. Earl's hand twitched near his weapon. For a long, taut second, Luke's finger hovered above his own trigger, ready. The red light of the sunset glowed against the iron, painting death and fire. But Earl hesitated. He studied Luke's stance, the steady line of his jaw, the certainty in his eyes. This wasn't a man bluffing. Luke Harlan was carved from the same hard earth as the West itself, unyielding, dangerous, and willing to kill if pushed. With a muttered curse, Earl jerked his chin at his men. "Mount up. This ain't worth it, not tonight." They backed down, grumbling, boots stirring dust as they swung onto their horses. Earl shot Clara a final look, his grin thin and cruel. "This ain't over, widow. You best remember that." Then they were gone, hooves pounding down the road, until the night swallowed them. Luke let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He slid his revolver back into its holster and turned toward Clara. Her shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of her. She met his eyes, her lips trembling as though she wanted to speak, but couldn't. Finally, she whispered, "I thought they'd—" Her voice broke, but she steadied it. "I thought I was alone." Luke tipped his hat back, his gaze steady on her. "Not anymore." For a long moment, the two of them stood in the twilight, the prairie wind tugging at their clothes, coyotes beginning their mournful song in the distance. The danger had passed, for now, but the bond forged in that red-lit standoff was something neither of them could ignore. Chapter 5, Milk and Moonlight. The night had settled deep across the prairie. Stars scattered like diamonds across black velvet. The air was cool, carrying the scent of sage and the faint smoke of Clara's kitchen fire. Luke had lingered after the standoff, insisting on keeping watch until he was sure Earl Bragg's men wouldn't circle back. Clara hadn't argued. Truth was, the thought of him leaving so soon made her chest tighten in ways she didn't fully understand. The farmhouse lantern glowed soft through the windows. Inside, the kitchen felt warmer than before, safer somehow, though the silence between them pulsed with something unspoken. Luke sat at the table, hat on the floor beside him, while Clara busied herself at the counter. She moved with deliberate care, as though the simple acts of pouring milk and slicing bread could anchor her trembling hands. "You didn't have to stay," she said, her back turned, voice steady but softer than before. Luke leaned back in the chair, the wood creaking under his weight. Couldn't ride off knowing they might come back. Men like Bragg don't give up easy. Clara set 2 glasses of milk on the table, then lowered herself into the chair opposite him. Her fingers smoothed the edge of her apron, restless, betraying nerves her voice tried to hide. "They've been sniff around since," she trailed off, the shadow of grief tightening her features. "Since my husband—" Luke nodded, his gaze steady on her. "I know. I heard their talk in town. That's why I came when I did." Her eyes flickered up to meet his, and for a moment the weight of her loneliness cracked, letting something vulnerable slip through. "You could have kept riding. Wasn't your fight." Luke shook his head slowly. "Don't sit right. A woman bein' hounded like that. A man's got to draw his line somewhere. Reckon I drew mine tonight." The room fell quiet. The only sounds were the ticking of the mantel clock and the faint chirp of crickets outside. Clara reached for her glass, lifting it to her lips, but her hand brushed Luke's across the table. She froze, the cool tin rim resting against her mouth, her eyes widening at the brief contact. Luke didn't pull away. He let his fingers linger, rough skin grazing hers, before curling them back around his own glass. The silence deepened, thick and charged. Clara took a sip, her throat tight. When she set the glass down, her voice trembled. "I don't remember the last time someone stood beside me. It's been so long, Luke." He studied her, the lamplight catching the auburn strands of hair that had slipped from her bun. Her eyes shone, not with weakness, but with the strength of someone who had carried too much alone. He swallowed hard, feeling something stir in him he thought he'd buried years ago. "Loneliness will starve a person," he said quietly. "Ain't just bellies that need filling out here." Her lips parted slightly, as if she might answer, but no words came. Instead, she reached for the loaf of bread she'd set between them, breaking it in half. She handed him a piece, her fingers brushing his again, and this time neither pulled away. They ate in silence, but it wasn't empty. The lantern's glow softened the edges of the room, casting golden light across their faces. Every small sound, the clink of tin against wood, the sigh of wind against the shutters, felt amplified, as though the night itself leaned in close, watching. When the bread was gone, Clara pushed her chair back and crossed to the window. She stood with her arms folded, gazing out at the vast sweep of prairie under the stars. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she whispered. "And terrible, too. Makes you feel small. Makes you wonder if anyone notices when you're gone." Luke rose, slow and deliberate, and moved to stand beside her. The boards creaked under his boots. For a moment, he didn't speak, just looked out at the endless dark with her. Then, softly, he said, "I'd notice." Clara's fingers loosened around her apron. Her hand slipped toward his, hesitating only a breath before finding it. Luke's rough palm closed gently over hers, the touch simple, yet it carried the weight of everything neither of them had dared to say. And in that moment, with the prairie stretching vast and lonely beyond the farmhouse walls, both knew that something had shifted. The night was still dangerous, the future uncertain, but neither of them felt truly alone anymore. Chapter 6, Fire and Fury. The prairie night had gone still, too still. The coyotes had fallen silent, and even the crickets seemed to have hushed. Luke sat on the porch rail, one boot propped against a post, his rifle across his knees. He felt in his bones the kind of silence that came before a storm, before trouble. Inside, Clara banked a fire, her lantern throwing soft light across the curtains. She had tried to convince herself the men wouldn't return, not tonight. But her heart hadn't stopped hammering since Luke first warned her. The sudden crack of a horse's whinny shattered the silence. Luke straightened, eyes narrowing. Out on the road, torchlight flickered, swaying in the darkness. Then came the sound of hooves, too many to count. The outlaws had returned. Luke stepped inside quickly, his voice sharp but calm. "Clara, get your rifle." Her breath caught, but she didn't argue. She reached for the old Winchester her father had kept above the hearth, the metal cool and heavy in her hands. She checked the chamber with steady fingers, though her heart threatened to burst from her chest. The horses thundered closer, and in the yard filled with shadows, men on horseback, torches in hand, faces twisted in firelight. Earl Bragg rode at the front, his grin a wicked slash. "Harland," he bellowed, voice carrying across the yard. "Step aside. The widow's land ain't worth your grave." Luke stepped out onto the porch, rifle raised but steady, his broad figure outlined against the lantern glow. "You had your chance to walk away, Bragg. Don't make me send you off in pine boxes." Earl laughed, the sound cruel and sharp. "You think you and that woman can stop us? We'll burn this place to the ground." He hurled his torch toward the barn. The dry thatch caught instantly, flames licking upward, painting the night in searing orange. Clara cried out, but Luke's voice snapped her back. "Clara," barn later. "Focus now." The first outlaw spurred forward, pistol raised. Luke fired. The shot cracked through the night, sending the man tumbling from his saddle. Chaos exploded. Gunfire, smoke, the screams of horses as bullets whistled through the yard. Clara braced the Winchester against her shoulder, sighted down the barrel, and pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed into her, but her shot rang true. An outlaw's hat spun into the dirt as he ducked, cursing. "Good shot," Luke called, reloading with practiced speed. The porch rail splintered near Clara's head as a bullet struck. She ducked, heart hammering, but forced herself back up, jaw tight. Fear burned hot inside her, but alongside it came something else, defiance. She wouldn't lose her home. Not again. Luke moved like a man born for battle, firing, ducking, reloading, each motion steady as stone. But Clara noticed how he stayed close to her, shifting to shield her whenever the gunfire grew too heavy. The outlaws pressed harder, circling, trying to flush them out. Earl shouted over the chaos. "She's just a widow, Harland. You're going to die for her." Luke's answer was another shot, the bullet grazing Earl's hat brim and silencing his laughter. "She ain't just a widow," Luke growled under his breath. The fire from the barn raged higher, crackling loud, sparks flying into the night. Clara's chest ached watching it burn, but she didn't falter. She reloaded, raised a rifle again, and fired at the men who dared threaten everything she had left. 2 outlaws lay wounded in the dirt now, groaning. The others, shaken by the resistance, began to falter. Their torches dropped one by one into the dust, sputtering out. Earl pulled his horse back, fury twisting his face. "This ain't over," he spat. "We'll be back, and next time you'll wish you were in the ground." Then, with a yank on his reins, he wheeled his horse, and the rest followed, thundering off into the dark. The yard fell silent again, save for the roar of the burning barn. Luke lowered his rifle, chest heaving, sweat streaking the dust on his face. He turned to Clara, who stood trembling, her rifle still in her hands. "You all right?" he asked, his voice rough but urgent. She nodded, though tears stung her eyes as she looked at the barn. "My father built that with his own hands." Luke stepped closer, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "Barns can be built again. You can't. Don't you forget that." Clara looked up at him, the firelight flickering across his face, painting him fierce and unyielding. In that moment, with her home in ashes and her body still shaking from fear, she realized what had taken root in her chest. Not just gratitude, not just relief, something stronger. She wasn't alone anymore, and neither was he. Chapter 7, A Rancher's Confession. Morning broke pale and gray over the Monroe homestead. The prairie still hushed as though weary from the night's violence. Smoke rose in thin curls from the blackened frame of the barn, its charred skeleton jutting against the sky like a monument to loss. Clara stood near the ruin, her arms wrapped around herself, her dress smudged with soot. Luke was already at work. Shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, muscles taut. He hauled scorched boards aside and stacked them neatly. His movements were steady, deliberate. Work was the only way he knew to quiet the storm inside him. "You don't have to," Clara said softly from behind, her voice frayed from exhaustion. Luke turned, sweat streaking the dust on his brow. "Yes, I do. Barn won't build itself." Clara's lips pressed into a thin line. She wanted to argue, to tell him she could manage, but the words caught in her throat. Watching him work, broad shoulders straining, hands blackened with ash, she felt something break loose inside her. For so long she had carried everything alone, forcing herself to be both strong and unyielding. But here was a man who didn't just pity her, didn't just offer empty words. He stood in the ruin and bore the weight with her. Together, they dragged broken timbers until the sun climbed higher, painting the prairie in gold. When Clara bent to lift another board, Luke stepped quickly beside her. "Careful," he said, steadying the timber before it slipped from her grasp. Their hands brushed, rough skin against rough skin, and both froze. Clara pulled back first, brushing soot from her apron, though her heart thudded like a hammer. "You've done enough, Luke. I can manage the rest." Luke studied her, his chest rising and falling, words pressing against his throat like a herd straining at the gate. He dropped the board with a thud and stepped closer. "Clara," he said, voice low, rough as gravel, "you don't have to manage alone anymore." The sun bled low over the plains, a molten orange disk sinking behind the hills. Dust rose in soft swirls where Luke and Clara stood before the rebuilt barn, its fresh timbers glowing in the fading light. The long fight was over. Bragg's gang scattered, the threat gone, and for the first time in years, the Monroe land felt safe. The wind carried the scent of sagebrush and distant smoke from the saloon down in Red Creek. A lone rider passed far off, the sound of hooves fading into the horizon. But here, on this patch of ground, the world felt still. Clara leaned against the porch post, her shawl wrapped loosely about her shoulders, eyes shimmering with the kind of peace she thought she'd never feel again. Luke stood close, hat in his hands, his rough voice breaking the silence. "I came here for milk, Clara," he said, a slow smile tugging at his lips. "But what I found was a home I never knew I was looking for." She reached out, her fingers brushing his, the touch as steady as the earth beneath them. "Then stay," she whispered, tears catching the sunset glow. "Stay, and let's make this land ours, together." Luke pulled her into his arms, kissing her with the surety of a man who had finally found his place. Behind them, the prairie stretched wide and endless, but neither felt small beneath it. As the last light of day faded, their silhouettes lingered against the horizon. Two souls who had walked through fire and found each other in the dust.